So, hi everyone. Welcome to this new episode of our Defend Democracy webinars. My name is Olaf Böhnke. I'm a senior advisor to the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity and the Alliance of Democracies Foundation. This episode today is called The Social Media Dilemma: Who's in control and who's to blame, the role and responsibility of social media platforms and the fight against election interference. As you've seen from the trailer, this is done in partnership with the US Embassy in Copenhagen. And let me quickly share with you our usual housekeeping introduction. And the main important one is ask questions at any time. Those registered beforehand and joining us in the Zoom room can use the Q&A chat box, and everyone else following on the various restreams on social media, please use the comment box and our team will collect all your questions and bring them forward to me later, and I'll try to include as many of them in the discussion. We are recording the session, obviously, and you can find the video anytime in our YouTube account. Before I give the floor to our distinguished panelists and introduce them and also give you a little bit backup on what we want to discuss today, let me kick off the debate by a quick poll, which might give us some useful background information about the preferences of our audience today, which registered for this debate. We will start very basic. The question is, overall, do you think that social media platforms like Facebook or Twitter have a positive or negative impact on democracy in general in your country? I have a couple of seconds. Don't wait too long. And the results are interesting. So only 5% think that social media has a very positive impact. 21 at least think it's somewhat positive. 63 think is somewhat negative. 11 think it's very negative, and no one thinks that social media doesn't have an impact. It's interesting that way because we used to ask this question during our Copenhagen Democracy Summit since 3 years now. And until last year, so there was never a majority who perceived the impact of social media as predominantly negative. So therefore, things obviously changed. So here comes the second question. In general, do you think there should be more or less regulation on content that people share on social media platforms? And I have a gut feeling what answer we might see. And the result is 78% think there needs to be more regulation, only 17% think it's okay like it is, and 6% are in favor of less regulation. And last but not least, one question before we enter the debate. When you think about the next major elections in your country, how likely do you think interference from foreign state actors will influence the results of the election? So we have 23% think it's very likely, 34% think it's somewhat likely, 31% think it's somewhat unlikely, and 11% are convinced it's very unlikely. So it's a slight majority for interference. It's a major issue, or could be it's an existing threat. And that's exactly the main purpose of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity, which is co-hosting this event. It is a committee of individuals who are all concerned very much about the threat of foreign election interference, and think that raising awareness about it should be our main objective. So therefore, that's one of the reasons why we engage in this debate and trying to share information about it, and also in the direct conversation with lawmakers and the policy community, try to push for concrete solutions to that problem. And of course, the threat assessment is very broad. So let's enter the arena and start the debate. The main purpose of this web talk, as said, actually is to discuss the role and responsibility of social media platforms. And as you know, there are a bunch of highly interesting proposals on the political table right now, namely the Digital Services Act, recently published by the European Commission, the British Online Safety Bill, or based on the Online Harms White Paper, and they're stuck in a political bottleneck for quite some time, are also a number of reform proposals for the famous Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act in the US. We are very grateful and glad that we could convince very distinguished speakers for our webinar today. And let me introduce them in alphabetical order. We have with us Damian Collins, who's a member of the British House of Commons and a co-chair of the International Grand Committee on Disinformation. Also interesting, he is a former chair of the House of Commons Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee, and in that function, he led the parliamentary investigations into the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and he's a member of the real Facebook Oversight Board, but he's not the only one. Then we have Eileen Donahoe, who's a member of our Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. She's the executive director of the Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford University, and a former US ambassador to the United Nations Human Rights Council. In Parliament, and he's the vice chair of the INGA Special Committee, which is the Special Committee on Foreign Interference in all democratic processes in the European Union, including disinformation. And I think actually you should get an extra award for that name of a committee, which is really one of the best. And I think we all have seen a lot of very interesting committee names, but that goes in my top three. And last but not least, we have Marietje Schaake with us, who actually doesn't need any introduction, I think. She's also a member of our Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity. She's the International Policy Director at Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center. She's the president of the Cyber Peace Institute, and she's a former member of the European Parliament, and especially in a period for the last 10 years when the discussion on digital threats has not been a front page issue. So therefore, we are really glad to have you to also walk us a little bit through the history, how legislators actually realized and when that there's an issue they should really take care of. In that regard, I would give the floor first to Damian Collins. I asked all the speakers to give us a little elevator pitch introduction, so what concerns them most when thinking back maybe to from the 2016 US elections or the Brexit referendum, where we have seen significant interference on the foreign side, also from domestic side. So, and what have you observed over these years? Actually, what is still on, so to speak, when it comes to threats, and where should we look at it when it comes to legislation? And then maybe you can share with us a little bit what the UK online safety bill has in it to it. Damian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Olaf. It's wonderful to be with you all. I'll start that actually where you finished off with the polling questions you did at the beginning of this webinar. And I think it's not surprising that on the final question about foreign interference in elections, the way the question was phrased, it said foreign interference will be likely to affect the result of the election. And despite the fact that everyone had voted very strongly saying there should be more regulation and that on balance, social media is doing more harm than good, far fewer people said there would be significant interference in an election in their own country. And I think that this gets to the heart of the problem, which I think this year has come into sharper, or in this last year has come into sharper focus, which is that I think people can see what's going on. And since the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the analysis of the 2016 Russian interference in the US presidential election, people can sort of understand what's going on, but they always ask themselves the question, well, would it ever affect the way I vote? You know, would it affect the outcome? It's bad that it's going on and someone should do something about it, but would it affect the outcome? And what we've seen in the last 12 months is the way in which people can be influenced in the way they behave by what they see on social media and the information they're targeted with. We've seen arson attacks on 5G phone masts because people believed they were spreading coronavirus. And we saw those extraordinary scenes in Washington on the 6th of January of almost an attempted insurrection in the capital, which had been directed and channeled by the Stop the Steal campaign on social media that started on the night of the presidential election, asserting that Donald Trump had won and the election had been stolen from him. And so I think we can look at those events and say, and look at the growth of conspiracy groups like QAnon, and say this problem of disinformation on social media is influencing the way people think about issues, and it's influencing the way they behave in the real world. And whilst when we think about elections in our own country, we might think, well, I would never change how I vote based on something I saw on Facebook. Nevertheless, the prism of Facebook and other social media channels where people now, many people mainly get their news from, is shaping the way they see the world and the way they behave. When we started the Select Committee inquiry you mentioned earlier on disinformation and fake news, we started at the very end of 2017, which seems like a very long time ago now, and we just started the investigation when the Cambridge Analytica story broke. And then we had a very good look at the issues surrounding that in an inquiry that lasted about best part of 18 months, all in all. When we started that inquiry, I think we thought about disinformation in the way that I think companies like Facebook want us to think about it, which is that I think at the start we thought about it as a content problem. The problem is bad people post bad content, and there's a question of what do we do about it? Now, that is a problem, but it's not the real problem. The real problem is that bad content is amplified on social media to reach large audiences, and that it's amplified largely by the platforms themselves. They are selecting and ranking content based on engagement and recommending it to people based on engagement as well. So when we talk about looking at the issues of how do we combat disinformation, how do we regulate the tech companies, the first thing we have to have in our mind is what we're regulating is not speech so much as a business model that promotes speech for engagement. And that business model is largely blind to whether that speech is harmful or not, because its principal job is to keep people's attention for as long as possible so that advertising can be run against that content and money can be made out of it. And so that's how you see it. There's been a lot of analysis of this in the last year of advertising being sold against YouTube channel or Facebook pages, where harmful content is being promoted. That extraordinary internal Facebook report that was published last year in the Wall Street Journal that showed that Facebook was driving people towards Facebook groups that shared extremist content, that 60% of people in Germany that joined groups that shared extremist content did so at Facebook's recommendation. And I was very interested to read as well recently an article that Bruce Reed, the new Deputy Chief of Staff of the White House, co-authored with Jim Sayer from Common Sense Media, that said, when we're looking at practices where social media companies are making money out of content, that's something which should fall under the scope of regulation, because that's something the companies have got some responsibility for. Now, briefly, with regards to the UK's approach to this, the recommendations that have come out of the Online Harms White Paper, many of them are very close to the recommendations we made in the Select Committee report. They are that we believe social media companies have a duty of care to their users, and that duty of care extends to protecting them from harmful content. Now, some of that content is already illegal, and therefore we would expect them to remove it. Images of child abuse are illegal and shouldn't be on social media, and they should remove them. But it also categorizes content that is harmful, but not necessarily illegal. Now, that in scope is disinformation that could lead to physical harm. And I think that's why some of the social media companies have acted against against COVID conspiracy theories, content that may cause people to take a treatment that could hurt them. And the social media companies say they will act against that. But I think there's also within that an issue of harmful disinformation that could harm society or groups of people within society. You could have content that is racist or homophobic, that isn't necessarily targeted at an individual person or inciting an individual act, but nevertheless could lead to harm being caused. I think the Stop the Steal campaign in America falls into that category of a drumbeat of a campaign over months that sought to undermine people's trust in an election that led to an insurrection where 5 people lost their lives. So I think as we take this bill through Parliament, one of the things we've got to think about is, what do we mean by harmful disinformation that could harm society rather than just an individual person? The second key thing I think that we have to focus on as we take the bill through Parliament is the role of legitimate news and journalism within online forums. The government response to the Online Harms White Paper says it will create a carve-out for news organizations. Well, we need to be very careful when we define what a news organization is in that case, because there are some of the most egregious spreaders of disinformation on social media are organizations that claim to be a news organization but actually aren't. So I think that's something we have to focus on. But the key things to making it work, making the online harms process work, are the establishment in certain cases of clear liabilities for the social media companies to act against harmful content. And for me, that's not just about removal where necessary, but also making sure they are not amplifying and boosting that content. For me, it would be a failure in their duty of care if they are directing users towards harmful content. It shouldn't just be about trying to remove that. And I think it's interesting today when the Facebook Oversight Board has met. I think it's interesting. I was rereading the charter of the Facebook Oversight Board last night. And people might think that if they had ruled on whether a piece of content should be taken down, and the Facebook Oversight Board agreed with Facebook that it should, that any examples of that content, that individual piece of content on the platform, the same piece of content presented in the same context, would automatically be removed as well. But there's no requirement to do that at all. All Facebook have to do is look into whether that is feasible. So there will be questions for them about the way they exercise that duty of care, both to remove content and not to amplify it. Finally, I'd just say the other key important part, duty of care and ending sort of protection from liability is part of it, is enforcement. And this is where what I think the UK government is looking at is slightly different from what the European Commission is looking at. And that's the role of giving a statutory regulator the power to be the auditor, to audit and inspect and demand access to company information in determining whether or not the company has met its obligations under the online harms legislation. And the government's proposing that would be our media regulator, Ofcom, effectively extending its powers as a content regulator into online media, where it already has a limited role, but as the regulator for online harms. As with the broadcasting code, it would be a body that is set up by Parliament and has legal powers, but would act independently of it, rather like the Information Commissioner does, our sort of data protection sort of policewoman. So that's sort of the general scope of the online harms legislation, well, proposed legislation. We expect a government bill to be introduced to Parliament this year.
Okay, thank you, Damian. And I think we'll get to some of the details maybe at a later stage. I will give the floor to Eileen now to share with us. So the US Congress is not there yet where the European Parliament and the British House of Commons is to discuss concrete proposals. But we know that over the last 4 years, there had been a lot of proposals being entering Congress, some of them not really serious, some of them very biased, but still, so if you would pick the best parts out of it and imagine actually what you think actually a Biden administration how they might put it together. So what do you think are the most relevant elements actually of what we have seen so far in terms of legislative solutions in the US?
I will definitely get to that, but I'm going to start with your opening question to us and what do we see in the change since 2016 and up to 2020? I see 4 big differences. Obviously, one is the change in the threat landscape, how disinformation has changed. Second is a change in the level of proactiveness on the part of the platforms. Third is obviously much, much bigger appetite on the part of government to regulate, which is what you just asked about, including in the US, certainly in Europe, but also now in the United States. The fourth piece I would also put on the table is changes in the larger geopolitical context that I think we all have to pay attention to if we care about protecting democracy. So just briefly on the threat landscape, obviously the big change in 2016, the biggest threat came from foreign malign actors reaching across borders. And it was really about fabricated personas and inauthentic amplification. So if you think about that ABC framework from Camille Francois, the problems were really the actors being malign foreign actors and the fabrication and manipulation of civic discourse in other countries. 2020, the problem is quite different. There's still foreign actors mixing with domestic, but the real problem is the organic domestic civic discourse. And the number one problem, in fact, was the President of the United States. And that is a pretty big factor. And it's obviously using social media very effectively, but also having the literal bully pulpit in the physical realm, the Rose Garden or wherever, then having cable television and talk radio and everybody amplifying, and then also utilizing social media better than anyone. And I would also add that in 2020, part of the problem was the content. It was inciting violence and insurrection. So that's another change. So the actor being the president of the United States and the content being inciting violence were the big factors. I will agree with Damian that now we need to look at the algorithmic promotion by the platforms as driving the impact of that inciting content. But to me, we also need to recognize we have a complete breakdown and deterioration in the civic culture in the United States. And we can't only be focused on social media platforms. We have a much bigger problem that we have to solve. And in some ways, this is kind of Putin's dream, to get Donald Trump to be the leader of the world in undermining the integrity of elections in his own country and role modeling that to autocrats around the world. So that's the first thing I would say. Second, in terms of changing, proactiveness at the platforms, obviously, 2016, Mark Zuckerberg said, "You're all crazy if you think we had any impact." Well, that looked pathetic then, and it looks more pathetic now. Everyone's gotten more proactive, labeling, warnings, debunking, pre-bunking, starting to take down things, and now deplatforming. But I think the basic assessment is too little, too late. And for me, I would say the problem in the platform side is an inadequate understanding of their own responsibility to democracy. And oh, by the way, their own understanding of what free speech entails on their platforms. They want to be free speech platforms. Well, part of that is protecting the user's right to access information, to form opinions, as well as to express themselves. And propagating disinformation certainly undermines the right to form opinions of users. And it also affects the right of citizens to engage in democratic elections. And undermining the will of the people and through propagation of disinformation should be seen as a responsibility of the platforms. So in my mind, real world harm isn't only incitement to violence or insurrection. I would consider real world harm undermining the integrity of election itself, just through claims of fraud and things like that. In terms of the appetite for the governments to regulate, obviously that has ramped up dramatically since 2016. NetzDG in Germany, the France Avia law, which then was struck down. Obviously, a lot of work in the UK white paper, Digital Services Act. My core concern with respect to the general trend in Europe is that I agree with a lot of what Damian said, but I somewhat wonder if the proposals for how to accomplish those goals actually end up creating more harm than good. And so in particular, I would point to the general trend toward imposing liability on platforms for user-generated content. For me, that is the linchpin of freedom online. And if that becomes the trend, that is that's basically getting the private sector to censor for you. And as you will, Russia, Venezuela, Honduras, Vietnam, and Belarus all copycatted the NetzDG regulation because it was so focused on content, shifting liability to the platforms, and then with the fines, getting quick takedown as a motivation. So I would request that all democratic governments be sure that you're not undermining the core principle of freedom on speech and especially freedom online through your regulation. And that's the problem I see in Europe to some extent. And some of the other proposals, they're good, but they're a little bit vague and hard to tell what other problems they're trying to solve, all in one bucket. In the US, we've seen many calls to revoke that fundamental legislation, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. A lot of confusion, though, because we've got calls from the right, from the Republicans, saying that it should be revoked because it's being, the platforms are using their powers in a biased and discriminatory way against conservatives. The Democrats also have called for revocation for the opposite reason: failure to take down enough content. We saw an executive order from Donald Trump in May threatening revocation, and it was basically a form of retaliation for Twitter simply putting labels and warnings on some of Donald Trump's tweets that were violative of their policies. He got a waiver, he's fit into the exception for being a political leader, and so he was allowed to make those comments. All they did was put up labels, and he's threatening retaliation. I think revocation of 230 is not a good idea. It's obviously politically fraught in any event. The better proposals out there are ones that are shared somewhat in Europe and elsewhere. There's a bill called the PACT Act, Schatz-Thun. It's bipartisan, and it primarily focuses on various types of transparency with respect for users, better transparency for users with respect to platform rules, changes in rules, complaint procedures, mechanisms for remedies, et cetera. So that's empowering users. It also has provisions about greater transparency about algorithmic promotion, decision rules embedded in algorithms, and being able to audit the impact of that algorithmic promotion. And so here I would agree with what Damian said at the top. The real problem is not that platforms are failing to take down the content of users or that they should be liable for it. It is the algorithmic promotion. That is why I think these transparency and accountability measures are the first necessary step. And if you don't have transparency, you cannot regulate that. I will also mention another more recent bill. It's Anna Eshoo, my congresswoman, and Tom Malinowski, former colleague from the US government and Human Rights Watch. They have a bill where about algorithmic promotion of content, violent extremist content that can be linked to real world harm. And I think those two bills are moving in a much more constructive direction rather than imposing liability on the platforms for user-generated content. I don't think that's the right move. Last piece, on the change in the geopolitical context, I think we should all be very concerned about is while we are so focused on American platforms and we have this transatlantic rift over technology policy between the United States and Europe over data sharing and content regulation, what's happening in the larger world is that China is basically dominating in the export of technology for repression, role modeling the utilization of AI for censorship online, and also really influencing the international diplomatic realm, both in terms of tech standard setting and even in normative arenas where they're basically getting the majority of countries to go along with how they're utilizing technology to repress citizens and dissidents in Hong Kong and minorities in Xinjiang. And I really feel like that the transatlantic partnership needs to be rebuilt. We need to get back on the same page and find a way to reconcile our differences so that we are working together to stop this larger trend toward digital authoritarianism that is spreading around the world. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Eileen. That's a lot to discuss. Next on my list is Morten to share with us a little bit the thinking inside the European Parliament and also behind the Digital Service Act.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the floor and for taking this opportunity to come up with some of the thoughts. Now, I would say it's a big task to represent the whole European Parliament as such. I won't go into that, I guess, but mainly concentrate on my own group and the role we have in the Parliament. I represent the Renew group. It's the old ALDE group, the Liberal group in the Parliament, which is the third largest. Just to inform you about that. Well, and I'll try to be brief since I have to leave at 6 o'clock European time. So I would try to, since so many good points already been made, I think from the speakers, I will try to concentrate on a few European Parliament points, so to say. I guess, but just as an introductory remark, I would say when talking about threats to democracy, foreign interference, social media chaos, and so on, I always found that one was running the risk of being seen as over dramatic and maybe exaggerating a little bit on the dangers. But those, I must say, were the old days. I think that if there ever was a time to use the term to lose one's innocence, this must be the time. I mean, when I a few days ago watched this storm on Capitol Hill, I realized that all these years of discussion have been, as a former speaker put it, a little too little and too late. And that is a confession I have to make to start, because this has been the main problem, as I see it, in the European Parliament the past 10 years. That we have now, I have the honor of being a member together with Marie Tchak. We were actually the two of us formulating the fake news, disinformation policy paper in the old ALDE group. But that doesn't make me an expert, and I think I'm not offending any of my colleagues if I say that big part of the problems in these years have been a lack of interest and a lack of knowledge about what was going on. And that, I think that is a point in itself, because this has led to a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of non-awareness of this problem. And now we are facing, all of us, even a blind man can see that we are facing very, very huge problems, not only in the US, but also in Europe. And maybe what we are doing now is too little and too late. The fact is that everyday citizens in our liberal democracies are under attack, and I think that most of us here will sign up to that. But 10 years ago, when I was new in the European Parliament, the big issue we were discussing with the platforms, if we could get a hold of them. I mean, I tried for several years to get in contact with Facebook. It was a very difficult task in those days, and we had Mark Zuckerberg here for the first time just a few years ago, as it was just referred to, and this was a big thing in Europe that the big Mark Zuckerberg visits us. But we didn't know that it was only because we had the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and then he was there, but all his lawyers. But anyway, it has been a very, very difficult task to get in contact with these platforms, and now, the past 2 or 3 years, of course, we see that there's a lot of cooperation between them and the services in the member states in order to avoid interference from foreign actors. And it's interesting when we look at the poll, we just seen the figures, and I find it interesting that not many people think that they are actually the ones that been interfered with. Because we don't think that this is our problem in our home member state, and this is for sure also a problem in my own home country, Denmark. We have I think the public opinion here is that this is of course a big problem for someone else, and I think we have to get to a point, politically speaking, where the voters are much more concerned about this. Before we can get away with regulation. I will come back to that point in a minute. I think the most visible action so far has been that the European Parliament now, at last, came up with the idea of a special committee to deal with these things. And as you rightly put it from the start, I have the privilege of being the vice chair, one of the vice chairs in this committee, but we are only starting. and it's only, on top of that, it's only 2 months ago we had the DSA, the Digital Service Act, presented from the Commission. So one point here is that it's very early days. It's very we can't go into details at this point in time because it's simply too new for us. We are still trying to find out what this Digital Service Act is meant to be, what the level of ambition is from the Commission side. And of course, at the same time, we have a lot of hearings, we have a lot of meetings in this new committee. We are sort of in the collecting mode still, trying to get a hold on the problem as such. And as it already been mentioned, I mean, there's a lot of questions to be asked, a lot of things to investigate. And my best guess would be that we are looking at least 4 or 5 months before we start the serious discussion about legislation or not on several issues. That's just a kind of disclaimer on my part. We are not there yet, where we can give decisive answers to some of the questions, unfortunately. But that's where we are. I think that if I look at this in a 10-year perspective, it is, and from my side as a liberal, I would say that it's getting clearer and clearer. What's already been pointed at from the former speakers, that this is a matter of transparency. I think that we are moving into a very dangerous field here when we talk about censorship. We're talking about freedom of speech and the points I've already pointed at from the side of Eileen. I think that in order to make this work also in the future, we have to be very, very clear. We must secure, I would say, unyielding, resolute transparency. This I think would be the key point for us as liberals. And what does that mean? Well, we have to find out what this. I think this is a good starting point for discussion. What does this unyielding transparency mean in practical terms? For me, it's about citizens must have complete transparency when they are subject to campaigns on social media. And the good question is of course how we do that. How can the social media help in making this complete transparency? The platforms must guarantee absolute transparency about why they choose to delete users or posts. I mean, this terrible thing about Twitter just closing for Mr. Trump. I mean, I'm not a big fan of Mr. Trump. I mean, no one in Europe seems to be the very big fans of Trump these days, and I can truly understand that. But the fact that Twitter just 1 week before him leaving the office closed his Twitter account, I think is a scandal. I think it's a scandal. They had years and years to do that, but just 1 week before, they suddenly get the courage to close his Twitter account. I mean, that just tells it all. What we need is, of course, to engage in how they do this, and to make some kind of rules on why one should do that as a social platform. And then, as a third point, we need broad transparency to understand the algorithms. Some points already been made. I think this is absolutely key. And I remember Marietje Schaake and I was talking about it already 7, 8, 10 years ago, about how to and this was very early days. No one really understood what algorithms were. And I think that was, as I made the point earlier, this was a big problem in these days, that the understanding of this and the knowledge of this was so low among politicians. It still is, but people get wiser by the day now. And I think we have to be much more informed about what are algorithms, and how do we deal with these algorithms in a regulatory way. And this sounds extremely boring, but it is key, I think, if we have to make a regulatory framework that actually will work and be future-proof. I think I stop there. I think I made my point. Transparency is key. And this will be my guiding line, and our guiding line in the work to come in this committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Morten. I have to reveal that Marietje has to leave in about 7 minutes, so therefore I give the floor to you. But I also forgot to mention that you are also a member of the real Facebook Oversight Committee. So Exactly. So, but you have experience as more no, as well. Actually, the last 10 years. So, what I found interesting is also that the EU Commission already, with the Code of Practice on Disinformation, started to plan a little bit the environment, and by the requirements and obligations put forward to the platforms, actually, they started to react. So, do you see it's moving in the right direction?
Well, so much has been said, and I also want to make sure that participants get to ask their questions, but maybe a couple of observations of what I think are long lines of sort of change that I've observed in Europe and now gradually also in the United States, which is that this is fundamentally a question of power. You know, how much power, agency, control, decisions are we willing to outsource to commercial players? In the case of the topic we're discussing now, to advertising platforms in the form of search and social media companies. And the reason why I think it's important to address this from a power perspective is because looking at speech and questions of censorship, as has been the very dominant lens in the United States for a long time, does not cover what is actually going on here. And if anything, the events of January 6th, I think, have made very clear for a growing group of people that this is about how disinformation leads people to act in the real world, how hate is not only spoken, but also organized online. And so how these companies are put in the position of making public policy, of basically saying, where does speech, which is, you know, very well protected in the United States, present a risk to public safety, for example. And similarly, we saw with the COVID outbreak that disinformation, and you can make all kinds of claims about the virus and alleged cures, but if it starts to bleed into public health and the ability to keep people healthy, then suddenly, you know, we're talking about a different concern. And I hope that this is going to widen the discussion in the United States, particularly because these are US-based companies, about what needs to happen now. And we see beyond interventions to achieve greater transparency and to clarify liability on the part of companies, a number of market interventions that are actually quite similar in the United States and in Europe, although Europe is more advanced with the Digital Services and particularly Digital Markets Act to spell out what the responsibilities of tech platforms are supposed to be. But in this space of antitrust, so looking at whether, for example, people's data has been handled properly, I think the sort of back end of the business models needs to be discussed more rigorously. Is not only the speech we can see that leads to concern of human rights and how they're balanced and whether they're actually respected and whether they should be commercialized, but also the question of which data is gathered and what is it used for. Is it desirable or is it harmful if we have people's most private information used to basically manipulate their decisions, including political decisions about voting, including in the context of the public and political debates that are happening with the sharing of news and information online. So what I hope, and that's also perhaps relevant on a day where the Facebook Oversight Board has made its first decisions, I hope we can talk about legitimacy, because clearly any kind of self-styled governance body or oversight mechanism can never replace actual independent oversight, democratically anchored legislation, rule of law principles, and truly independent accountability and oversight. And I hope that we will not lose sight amidst all the incidents and incident responses of that bigger picture. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. We have another round of questions prepared, or just two questions for the audience, or to wake up everyone. Well, we can just run them quickly, and I'm mostly interested in the last question we had. So the first is the question if platforms need more regulations or if more regulation would limit the freedom of speech. That sounds simple, but it's a very decisive question, as Eileen pointed out rightly. And 77% think that or favor more regulation instead of fears for freedom of speech. And the last question, of course, would be the obvious. So Maricha had to leave. So was it the right decision to deplatform Donald Trump? And answer the question in the context of what the question you just answered before. And that's interesting. I had expected something else. So 53% think it was the right decision, 47 disagree and think it's the wrong decision. And yeah, and that brings us exactly. I remember back from the at the Munich Security Conference a year ago. No, in 2019, Maricha and I, together with our commission member, Thomas Hendrik Ilves, were sitting in a closed room hosted by Facebook, and a high-level Facebook official opened the conversation, which was off the record, therefore I don't give you a name, by saying, please, regulators. And since then, I've been to many places where Facebook representatives, and Facebook is just one example, actually, it could be Twitter or others actually, and where I listened to that very same call over and over again. And at that time, actually, many people commented on this and saying, okay, I'm not helping Facebook to whitewash actually their bad reputation, so they should do more on their own. Now, I read yesterday, Damian read the constitution of the Facebook Oversight Committee. I read the op-ed Mark Zuckerberg published in March 2019, in which he exactly said the same. So please. I would play devil's advocate. Haven't the platforms officially called for being regulated for many years by now? So is it fair just to blame the platforms for not doing enough, or is it also something we have to consider? Okay, maybe, as many of you already pointed out, so people have not taken this issue seriously enough. Maybe the platform officials actually had been aware all the time that something big would happen. I don't know. What will be your take?
Do you want us to just jump in?
Yes, of course. Yeah, it should be an interactive conversation now. We have 10 minutes, and I will feed you with questions from the audience in a second.
I'll try to be super quick. I think in terms of regulation, definitely there should be much more activity on privacy. And if you go back to the Cambridge Analytica scandal, so much of it was because there was zero respect for the privacy and of users and how anything would be spread and used by others. And so I think that's really important. As I said earlier, I don't think regulation that leads to liability of the platforms for what the users say, user-generated content. I think that is a mistake, because that is what authoritarians want. But I do think transparency and accountability, as we've discussed, so that I thought Morten's points about, that citizens don't understand what it means to live and work in a algorithmically driven system. And so until we have transparency about that for citizens and users, and similarly for regulators, we are all subject to dynamics that we don't understand. And so I really do think transparency and accountability is important. I'll take a shot at the deplatforming issue. I generally think it was the right decision. And if you look at the explanation, it was based on a real world fear. It looked very realistic to Twitter that after the 6th, that any tweeting between the 6th and the 17th, which was the next big protest riot being called for, and the 20th, Trump's tweets would have led to much more significant incitement to violence. So in that sense, it was a good move. But again, on Morten's point, we don't understand how those decisions are being made. And so I do think it warrants for the users to have more insight into what are those rules and how are those decisions being made is an essential thing. So user control, platform procedural rights for users, portability of data, privacy of data, and then transparency are the big moves for regulators.
Damian, do you think the platforms walking in the right direction, or do they need a more push?
I think it's interesting because in 2020, be it on COVID, anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, and then Donald Trump, they started to demonstrate that when it's their reputation on the line, they take responsibility. We saw them making decisions on content that I don't think they would have made before. Be it the decision to ban, we could argue about how effective they were, but I mean, the decision to ultimately deplatform Donald Trump, the decision to ban QAnon, the groups on Facebook. I don't think they'd have made those sorts of decisions before. So I think they, in duress, and under public pressure, they started to move. But I think on their question about saying that we want to be regulated, I think that's sort of true. They do have a fashion. I think the Facebook Oversight Board is kind of like what Mark Zuckerberg thinks about regulation, which is that it's largely an external check as to whether they follow their own policies correctly, not someone setting standards for them. And also the regulation is at arm's length. It's largely based on content people can see. It's not regulation looking at company data and looking at the metadata of the platform to see, well, could they have spotted this problem sooner and should they have done more about it before they did? That's what real regulation would look like, and I think they are still resistant to. I think on the question though of deplatforming Donald Trump is that do we want the chief executives of these companies to be the people that make that decision? So when do you deplatform a president? And I think there needs to be a regulatory framework around them, like we've created for almost every other major industry in the world has guidelines it works within. And even look at the financial sector, which is not perfect and doesn't have a regulator standing in every office, but there are rules. There are rules that companies are asked to follow, and if they fail to meet those standards, they know there are real risks attached to that, to their, not just their reputation, but to their bottom line. And the tech companies have no such jeopardy at the moment. If I see suspicious transactions in my bank, not that I have a bank, but if I did, then I have to report it. I'm supposed to report it. If I don't report it, if I fail to act, then I can end up in trouble. But there's no such jeopardy for the social media companies. There's nobody really has the power to really see what's going on inside of them. And that I think is one of the things that has to change if we want them to take more responsibility, because we need to be able to audit what they do. I agree. The amplification point is, for me, the amplification point in terms of like their duty of care. I don't think, looking at the UK legislation, what we're proposing is Facebook should take full liability for everything anyone posts on their page at any time. I think it's more question, if that's half a dozen people seeing it, the level of harm that's been done is relatively small. But to try and create more friction in the system when content is going viral, is being pushed by organised groups through the platform, and that content is harmful, I think that's where we want to challenge them to say that, and that's where I think they should be regulated, how they respond in those situations, what they do, and actually whether they were irresponsible. Otherwise, if we see, the 6th of January is a good example of what can happen when things go wrong. It could have been a lot worse, and maybe we'll deal with things in the future that are much worse than that. But when do you intervene? Is it okay to announce an insurrection on Facebook, to plan it on Facebook, to invite people to it on Facebook, but it only becomes an issue Facebook will deal with when the first person gets killed? That's when the imminent harm threshold has been crossed. So I think that we need some rules on this, and we need a mechanism to hold the platforms accountable for how effectively they meet those rules.
Mm-hmm. Martin, is it also an issue of scale? So by reading, for instance, recent reports by Facebook or Twitter regarding the US election story, sometimes you get shocked how many accounts they closed and stuff you don't see. We're not talking about thousands, we're talking about billions. I think it's in some statistic of Facebook, actually, I read that they shut down 3.6 billion, or it was Twitter actually, tweets actually they deleted. So it's kind of unimaginable for a human individual actually to imagine that this is just possible. So therefore, I don't want to open the antitrust discussion here, but is it also something actually that the monster they created actually get out of their hands?
I think the last image you showed us here is actually right. At one point I asked about how many fake accounts they actually were dealing with, and it's like 600 million since the past 6 months, and that was a kind of an eye opener to me. That is 3 or 4 years ago now. During the Brexit campaign. So, I mean, of course, the scale matters here, and the size matters. I mean, this is obvious. And I think the image about this Frankenstein monster is actually quite well put, because I think that's exactly what happens. I mean, with these CEOs, these founders of these companies I don't think they ever thought they would end up in a situation like this. And now they ask for regulation, and I do understand that, because they want to push the responsibility of all these accidents and all these mistakes and all these terrible accidents towards the political level, because they don't want to stand alone with this responsibility anymore. And this is threatening their business model. Now, that's the only reason they're doing it. And I must say, I have lost all my illusions when it comes to these platforms. I mean, as I already illustrated by my former answer, that Mr. Zuckerberg came here once. He was pushed by his lawyers, and suddenly he realized there was something that was called Europe, and we actually have something to say and about his company over here. And since then, they have been pushed and pushed and pushed, and now they've been pushed by reality. And I do agree that this Capitol Hill storm was another eye opener, another incident that made it very clear to them that if we don't do something for them, they end up in a mess, and they will lose Twitter, for instance. They lost 40 million accounts just in a few days because of this. I mean, this is serious business for them. They can be out of business in a few years and overtaken by others if they don't react to this now. So now they're in a situation where they actually ask for regulation. And the next question, of course, good question, is what does it mean to say regulation? Because, and that goes into the answers we just had. I mean, of course they want regulation, but they don't want to be regulated. So they want something. They want a framework that they can call regulation, so they can push the responsibility towards the political level. And of course, in this minefield, we have to find a solution, a balance between these things. But I don't want to repeat what I already said. I think that as Eileen just put it, and Damian also, that this is a matter of accountability and about transparency, I think, because we have to take this responsibility of freedom of speech very seriously.
Yeah, going back to the idea you had, Damian, regarding certifying news outlets on social media, so which is, I think, is an interesting one. We have a question from the audience, but that reminded me of that. So that we have, for instance, NewsGuard, which is a private institution actually, which is doing that job in a way actually. So they are ranking. They have a very transparent categories actually of ranking what defines a serious news outlet. So we have that. A question from the audience, which goes in this direction, which was also tackled by Francis Fukuyama in a recent Foreign Affairs piece of middleware. So he said, as a user of social media, I would like to be able to turn off all content from profiles, companies that are not strongly identified via a national identification system. This should reduce the issue with troll farms, for instance. So if we would have if we would have that kind of middleware which helps us to navigate without the control by the big platforms, would that help? And we leave it with that with the last question, because then before everyone drops out.
Yeah, sure. So a couple of things on media points. Firstly, in the UK, we have broadcasters are regulators. They have a license from a regulator Ofcom. So I think my view would be that they don't, what they do, and including their content being shared through social media, shouldn't need to come under the scope of online harms or require intervention from the social media platforms themselves, because there's already a regulatory body and a complaints procedure that's attached to that. So if you've got a problem with something on the BBC that you've seen on Facebook and you don't think is right, then there are ways you can complain, and you don't need to complain to Facebook, and Facebook doesn't need to be responsible for that. Print media in the UK is a different matter, because it's not regulated by a formal body. There, I think this is not unlike the debate about verified accounts. The social media companies do this anyway. They decide to give little ticks to people based on their own view as to whether they know who the organization is, they think it's legitimate, they think it's got a decent following, and it deserves to have the verification tick. So I think what we've got to do is come up with a formula that says we think these are the criteria that legitimate mainstream organizations, media organizations have. And the key thing for that is about transparency of the organization, so that if you don't like what that media organization is saying, there is a person in a building you can complain to, or you can sue, or there's some method of redress. And I think what NewsGuard do, and it's not perfect, but they try and give users clues as to whether they should trust this organization or not, based on the characteristics of new organizations you can trust. And I think that's important. There's one final thing, just going back to Trump, I wanted to add in as well, is that I was very interested in what the network broadcasters did on election night in America the day afterwards. They made an editorial decision to stop broadcasting his press conferences because they thought what he was saying was so outrageous. So we have this odd situation at the moment where social media has become the main broadcast channel for many people for news, that no one at the moment has got the right to say, well, there should be an intervention here because we think this is, incendiary and dangerous. Whereas in all other media, editors make those decisions every day. And we don't think that CNN not broadcasting a Trump speech is censorship. Well, some people probably do, but we don't characterize it as such. Editors already make decisions on freedom of speech issues at the moment now. The question is, the world are getting its media through a pipe, which no one is in control of, apart from the people who've got the architecture to force content through it.
I have to jump in one quick comment. In the United States, because of the First Amendment, Congress, we're not going to have regulators telling platforms what content they can and cannot, spread, because the only thing that the U.S. government can restrict is incitement to imminent violence. And so we're not going to have the same regulatory approach in the United States as might be possible in Europe. That said, I think that the problem in terms of the monster getting out of control of the platforms, they are not bound by the First Amendment. They could be much more proactive in restricting speech as a manifestation of their own speech. They don't want, hate speech and all kinds of stuff that might not otherwise be restricted in the United States. The platforms have that power. They should turn to Article 19 and 20 of the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil Political Rights, and there are much more fulsome bases upon which speech can legitimately be restricted under Article 19 and 20, as long as you think about the necessity and the proportionality of it. But I think that there is a basis for being much more proactive on the part of the platforms. And then I think we're all asking that they have to also be transparent about what their rules are and how the decisions are made with respect to the rules as written.
Thank you very much. And sorry for going over time, but it was too interesting. And as I assumed at the beginning, we just started actually to have a serious conversation. So therefore, I'm pretty sure we will continue this conversation. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Damian, very much for joining us. Thanks to the audience for staying with us. And follow us on our social media channels actually to be part of the next webinar we're doing on this. Also, thanks for the US Embassy in Copenhagen for helping to host this. And I would say I wish you a great day wherever you are, and stay tuned. We will see you.